Hello, my fellow geeks. Welcome to episode number 53 of the Indian AvGeek. My name is Vishal Mehra. If you thought Bangalore traffic was insane, wait till we talk about what happens when someone decides to make flying cheaper than an Uber ride. Today on the show, we have Professor Satya Chakravarthy, founder, CEO, CTO of the ePlane company, a technologist with one foot in the lab and the other on the tarmac. Professor Satya builds aircraft thinking like an engineer and dreams like a designer. Today, he's here to pull back the curtain on the tech, the trade offs, and the true ambitions behind electric flight, and to tell us which bits of aviation lore still keep him awake at night. This is the Indian AvGeek, and today we are flying electric with Professor Chakravarthy. Welcome.
Hi, good to be here.
Professor, what got you interested in aviation and mobility in the first place? What first sparked your fascination with aerospace engineering?
So just an accident like lots of other people getting into IIT with a particular rank and what you can get with that and all that stuff. But I think more importantly, the question that you're asking about aviation and mobility is a different ballgame. One thing for sure is aerospace is actually still kind of like a pie in the sky for most people. And is it possible for us to actually bring it closer down to earth and more accessible to everyone? That's what more or less mobility is all about. For me, if I were to actually think about mobility going around the world, it still needs to be much faster than present day planes. And we'll wait to get there. But uh, right now, we need to worry about like getting around the city. And that's what for most of us, mobility is all about. And question is, what can we do in aviation to make that happen? Was what was bothering me.
Then that makes me ask you, what sparked your transition from a long academic career at IIT Madras, where you still teach, to founding deep tech ventures like ePlane and Agnikul Cosmos?
Two or three things. One is, I think we were establishing the world's largest combustion research center, which involved very detailed engineering on lots of setups, which are very difficult to operate or even construct and so on. It required a lot of designs and all that stuff. So we were doing some very fancy engineering at a cutting edge. So it showed that there is capability for us to be able to do this, number one. Second, I think there were co-founders on the other startups that actually walked up to me and said, let's do this or that. And I was obviously signing up with them, saying, yes, we can do it because we have the engineering ability to do so. Thinking about the market part of it, the problem solving part of it, like what business case we are having and all those things before. But gradually, progressively, as we were talking to investors to raise money for those startups, I learned the ropes on what's meant by a startup in the first place, and what we need to really be doing in terms of like identifying a problem, solve, and something of societal impact, and as well as business impact, and so on. So that's when the ePlane thing also happened. But alongside this, I think the India startup story was actually beginning to blossom around the late 2020 teens. And it looked like I could actually smell a whiff of the startup air around, particularly at IIT Madras. And I thought I'll jump in.
You have described yourself as passionate about defrastructure. Can you explain this concept to us, and how it's driving your various ventures across aerospace, space technology, and mobility?
Right. So I think the idea of infrastructure has been around. It's just that we've not really seen it, as much. I grew up at a time in India where getting like a telephone connection was very difficult. And then the problem with that was that apparently the last mile copper cable that needed to be laid from like the street corner down to your, inside your house, was actually like a biggest, problem. Now the mobile phones actually changed the whole thing. So what it essentially meant was that we were essentially saying the infrastructure can actually be only half of the problem. Let's actually stop the infrastructure with just cell phone towers. It doesn't have to come home all the way to you, and you instead actually have a handset that can access this cell phone tower, right? And so that's one example. The second example that, of course, is not still very commonplace in India yet, although solar power is actually has attained grid parity in India. We still do not really have rooftop solar, and compared to what we see in the Western countries, where you are allowed to have the ability to generate power as much as to consume it, what they call as a prosumer. And that essentially means that you're not really dependent on the city utility infrastructure of giving you power into your homes. You can actually generate it from within your home, or right at the rooftop of your home. And if you're actually generating excess power, you have the ability to put it back into the grid and make money, or pay negative electricity bills. That's actually again a defrastructure. That essentially means that utilities do not really have the headache of having to generate so much electricity. They just have to manage the grid and so on, right? The problem statement for them changes, and the problem statement for you is it possible for me to actually manage my own electricity needs as much as possible? So these are a couple of examples of what has already happened in the last couple of decades on what I would call as defrastructure. But this needs to actually happen in the mobility space. And particularly if you're now looking at things like uh, aerospace, it's in some sense it's actually been happening. So I want to actually also identify one of those things. The Airbus A380, the full double decker, is actually the largest aircraft that was ever built, and unfortunately, it has actually had the
Commercial
shortest
aircraft,
production
the
run.
largest commercial aircraft. Yeah.
The largest commercial double decker, full-fledged double decker, unfortunately, has had the shortest production run. And what does that really say? So what it means is that there are now much sleeker, more energy efficient aircraft like the Boeing Dreamliner, and similarly what Airbus is also trying to put out at a smaller level, uh, which essentially allows you to go from point to point instead of the hub and spoke model. If you look at the aviation scenario, the hub and spoke system actually has got dismantled, and everybody wants to actually go from an airport that's near to where they are to directly to an airport that they want to go to, instead of having to go to a hub and all that stuff, right? And that's because there are now smaller aircraft that will directly take you to where you want in a much more fuel efficient manner, and therefore the cost can actually be easily managed without having to fly large sets of people together and so on. That's kind of like a very small level of defrastructure. Although you might argue that, hey, that means that we need to have like a lot more airports, right, and all that stuff. But these airports don't have to be very big, so you don't have to have like massive airports with 4 or 5 huge terminals. If you go to like a Heathrow or any of those, going from one terminal to another is actually such a big pain, and each of those terminals is like such a big airport. Strictly speaking, we shouldn't have to have all of those things. So if you now cut to where we are doing what we're doing, we're basically saying, well, is it possible for me to actually get the plane to where I am, hopefully to my rooftop if possible, or to the street corner, or anywhere in the neighborhood, so that I'll actually ideally have to just walk to catch a plane and then go to where I have to, and walk to my actual destination, if not exactly right at the point where I have to be. Going forward, this thing actually can change to going from one city to another city itself without having to actually go to an airport at all completely, and fly from a rooftop here to a rooftop there, sort of thing, right? Which essentially means that all of that airport infrastructure can be taken out of the equation, and you can essentially have like a on-demand mobility, which is demand in space and time. That is, you have to actually get the aircraft to come to where you are and go to where you want to at a time that you want to, right? Very similar to a taxi, and so on. So that is one item of defrastructure. The other thing, if you want to think about space launch vehicles. So we make these rockets that can actually be positioned on a trailer truck, and we can actually move the rocket along with even a power generator. Even if you don't have power in the place where you have like a barren piece of land for you to launch from, you can actually take a diesel genset along and be able to actually articulate the rocket out of the trailer truck and position it there. Just have to maybe evacuate human habitation for safety within a certain radius, launch, and then you're done and dusted about the launch, and then you can come back home. So that means that you don't need to have these massive launch pads, space ports, and all of those things. Just a barren piece of land is good enough, and so on. So that's a piece of infrastructure. We are also making power generating gas turbines as well as crude oil from municipal solid waste, and the gas turbine actually can take the crude right away instead of having to go through a refinement of the crude into a diesel or a petrol or a kerosene or any of those variants, and which essentially means that you can locally generate the crude with much less refinement in terms of like going to a refinery and all that stuff. You can put it out into a power generator. You can locally generate the power. You don't need like massive thermal plants or even large scale solar that guzzles up a lot of land. So all of these things can actually get distributed across the land, and everybody can actually start jumping into it in terms of job generations and all that stuff. So these are all things that I would say are aerospace kind of technologies that can be brought down to earth for a lot of people to participate in, and dismantle this large infrastructure requirement for us to actually be like a developed country.
Very interesting. Makes me ask, how do you decide which aerospace problem is worth solving? And can you share a moment when you knew this idea has to fly as far as ePlane company is concerned?
I think the first thing that we have to always worry about is not slot ourselves into like an aerospace problem versus like a mechanical problem or a business problem or any of those kinds of things. The solution could be whatever it is, but it has to actually solve a credible problem. And what is meant by a credible problem is that it has to be useful to some people. That means that you should be solving a problem for some set of people. So long as you're actually solving a problem for some people instead of solving an imagined problem, you think that this is a cool problem to solve because it's difficult, but nobody cares about it. That's something that I would all the first place. The next thing that actually I have to ask myself is, this is kind of like maybe if you can call it like a pride or something like that. I want to actually be able to touch a lot of lives. So it's not just sufficient if only a certain set of people are benefited from this solution, and they are the ones whose problem that we are trying to solve, but it has to actually you know address a large set of people. The market size should actually be significant. Why am I thinking that? Is A, of course, we want to make the greatest impact with whatever innovation that we do. But more importantly, if you're doing aerospace based solutions, the cost of developing that solution is actually not so small. And therefore, in order for you to be able to justify why you're doing this in the first place, it's very important for you to actually target a large market size. So, a customer identification, customer discovery is very important. Second is you need to be targeting large market size. Three, you should actually look at a good product market fit. I think these are the about rather than starting with saying that, hey, this is an aerospace problem that I like.
And we will talk about some of those points as we go further in our chat. You mentioned how ePlane company aims to democratize urban air mobility with compact eVTOLs. How do you balance range, payload, cost targets when designing your initial prototype?
Yeah, so I mean, when you now have all these contours, like boundaries, like saying that you need to actually target a certain range, certain payload, and all that stuff. Obviously, from an engineering point of view, there is always a trade-off. If you were to be dealing with cargo, for example, you might be able to say, okay, I need to get this little extra range, therefore let me shave off a little bit of cargo, which could be about 10 or 20 kgs, and that can actually give you another 10 or 20 kilometers, or whatever that is. But if you're taking people, you can't shave 10 or 20 kgs in payload, right? So, and then it is super important for you to make sure that a certain number of people comfortably can travel. So that means that you now have a pecking order on what's more important than the other in terms of the metrics to solve for, right? So that means that if I'm taking people, I have to make sure that I'm targeting the payload and there is no compromise on the payload. And unless you're actually talking about like a large payload, like let's say, for example, we have seen, people developing like a 19-seater and then they're not able to actually take more than 15 people. Maybe it's okay, but strictly speaking, you should have figured out how to take the 19 people that you originally targeted to do, because 19 people are actually the literal payload in the sense that they are going to pay, right? And that's what's important for you. Now, the question then is, what's the range that you can get? And the range is something that you can actually try to work on a lot of technological development and the engineering, and all of that stuff like lightweighting or whatever it is, right? So lots of things can be done to improve the range. And what's actually a good range? The answer is, unless it's actually woefully very, very short, which is like completely meaningless for anybody, um, any better range is always, any more range is always better, right? So you're always a sucker for range. So you then say that I'm actually going to preserve my payload, then actually try to shoot for as much of a range as possible by better and better engineering. But the moment you actually are able to get to a threshold where there is a technological leap, then you can actually come back and say, hey, is it possible for me to actually double my payload? Right? So for the same range that I have achieved. And then you now target taking like double the payload or maybe 1.5 times the payload, which means like if I'm taking two passengers, can I actually do three? Can I do four? Right? And then target the same range. And then you now say, okay, I've now conquered the point to where I'm actually taking four people. Can I now push on the range part on that? So it's kind of like you have to kind of take these steps, right? But you need to know which is the first step that you have to take and hold on to it before you can actually take the second step. So that's the way I would actually optimize this problem.
Getting DGCA's design organization approval is a major regulatory milestone, right? What were the toughest certification hurdles and how did you overcome them?
When we start a startup, I think we are just, our North Star is that we need to actually develop a product. But unfortunately, the product that we are developing actually has huge regulatory underpinnings that we have to embrace. And one of the things I've seen people say is, oh, this is actually hugely regulated. How are you going to manage this and all that stuff? But the more important thing is understand why you have these regulations, what's the purpose of this, and if you're able to uh, uh, validate this for yourself, justify this for yourself, why the certification regulations are required, then you actually say, hey, tell me what exactly I need to do, and then let's get going with it. Let's look at what needs to be done and go do that. I mean, if you're able to actually make a plane, you should actually also be looking at how to look at all the regulatory requirements and then follow them. So the first part was when we started, we just want to make a plane, but we have no idea about regulations. So when you now start thinking about regulations, the biggest challenge for us is to actually wrap our head around it, understand what is required, and get this mindset that we need to comply. And that's actually something not so obvious for an academic in the first place, B, a startup co-founder, a combination of an academic and a startup co-founder. So all of these things. So we need to kind of learn to comply, right? So that's something that that's actually the biggest hurdle in my mind. It's actually more of a mental thing. But the moment we actually started doing that, we said, let's actually work with the DGCA. It's been a great journey. DGC has been extremely cooperative. They are very happy with what we are doing, and they are happy to educate us if we are actually faltering, and so on. There's a lot of humility that we need to have in order to go through these kinds of compliances, and they appreciate it when we are humble.
You've mentioned in the past that the E200X's unique aerodynamic synergy. Can you explain this breakthrough and how it differentiates your aircraft from all the global competitors?
Right. So there is a certain like sequence of thoughts that actually takes us to what we're doing, and more importantly, why we're doing what we're doing, right? And what I want to actually highlight is that this is actually completely a business-driven innovation. It's not just a technological innovation for its own sake, right? The business-driven innovation here is that we are actually trying to make a taxi. And what are the characteristics of a taxi? A taxi has to actually get to where you are. And that means that we have to be able to land on your rooftop, which means that it has to have a very, very short wing. That's one. The second, a taxi cannot really have a downtime charging after every trip. It has to actually be able to do multiple trips before it can actually have a downtime charging. Otherwise, you will not be able to utilize the asset completely by the end of the day. So
Yeah, I mean, it'll only make money when it's flying, not on the ground.
exactly, which means that when the more you're actually having a downtime charging, you're not making money, right? So if you have to maximize on the money that you can make, you need to be able to do multiple trips. So how do I actually do multiple trips? Is to first of all be able to do a long trip in a single charge that should be broken down to multiple short trips in a single charge. So for me to do a long trip in a single charge, I need to have wings. Wings are the ones that will actually save power on board because the wind around the wing will actually just generate the lift that balances the weight of the aircraft. And the power on board is required only to overcome the wind resistance. And the wind resistance is typically much smaller when compared to the power it takes for you to balance the weight of the aircraft completely, which is the reason why helicopters guzzle a lot more fuel when compared to planes. And the reason why planes have wings is because you can actually save a lot of power on board. Uh, Given that, and also the fact that you need to have short wings, then we have to ask the question, what next is the requirement? If I have to do these short trips, I also actually have to fly very slowly because by the time, if I'm actually flying very fast, by the time I accelerate to that speed and then come back down, I would have actually clocked a much longer distance than what I would effectively need to do for like a short trip. So the combination of a short wing, having a wing in the first place, and a slow speed um, is actually a very peculiar combination in aerospace. Typically, you have very long wings like for gliders, which fly very slowly, and we have fairly short wings for military jets that fly very fast. So here we are talking about having the opposite combination of short wings and slow flight. And how do you then crack that code is to actually recognize that we have a VTOL. So when you have a VTOL, you have vertical takeoff rotors that let you take off in the first place, and then you're going to use them only when you want to land, which means that you're carrying a lot of dead weight with you. So there are other people who have instinctively said that we need to tilt these rotors so that we are not actually having too much of a dead weight. The answer is you require a lot more rotor power for you to take off because the weight of the aircraft is a lot more. Whereas you don't need to tilt all of the rotors, or if you tilted many of those rotors, you'll have to power them down extremely because you don't need that much power to go forward. So anyway, you are carrying a lot of dead weight. So the tilt rotor does not really buck the dead weight problem. And it has these other problems like it's a single point of failure. You may have a problem with certification and all that stuff. So we want to keep it simple. We want to have separate set of rotors, but how do you actually make sure they're not a dead weight? Get them to participate in the forward flight by getting them to work on the wing instead of just generating brute force vertical lift and guzzling power during forward flight like a helicopter. Instead, what you do is you actually position them around the wing in such a way that the flow field around the wing is altered and the wing start generating a lot more power just because you are operating these vertical rotors at some power down level at those key locations. And that's what we do that allows us to have a short wing, fly slowly, and do multiple short trips in a single charge.
That's a perfect segue to my next question, actually. I've read how the E200X has completed over 196, I think, design iterations. It's an extraordinary amount of refinement. Can you walk us through how this iterative design process actually works? What specific performance metrics or challenges were driving these iterations? You mentioned few like not flying too fast or having a certain design for urban mobility. What else?
Oh yeah, quite a few other things. I mean, from a technical point of view, we keep track of lots of different metrics of different components of the aircraft. So one of the things that we don't really talk about in a plane design is its stability. So we obviously want to actually have a plane that's reasonably stable, in fact, fairly well stable. We don't need like a super rock solid stable aircraft that will make sure that you're going to guzzle a lot of power for changing your direction and all those things. But you need to have this optimum stability that will ensure that it can withstand gusts very well and all those things. So for you to be able to actually get a stable aircraft, there are multiple different configurations that you have to try with different kinds of angle settings for the wings and the relative positioning of these wings with respect to the center of gravity, all of those things. Plus, we are actually also doing a VTOL, which means that we have to worry about how the aircraft is going to perform during a vertical takeoff and landing phase versus how it's going to transition into the forward flight, which means that where is the center of gravity of the aircraft going to be located with respect to the vertical rotors? Where is the center of gravity of the aircraft going to be located with respect to the wings? It has to actually be, we have to look at both modes of flight, and the aircraft should be configured to suit both without guzzling too much power in either of these segments. So in addition to that, we also actually have to optimize on the power consumption of these rotors in the first place, getting the blade angles and the blade shapes and all that stuff right. And so we do lots of those simulations in order to get to bump up the thrust to power ratios of these vertical rotors and forward propellers as well. And how do we actually position these rotors and propellers around the wing in order to actually maximize the lift and therefore decrease the speed at which we will go, and on the whole try to get the power consumption on board to be the bare minimum, and so on. So these are all multiple different metrics that we actually look for, that we keep on, iterating upon to just improve. So, and then there are also these contradictory things. Like if I'm actually improving the thrust to weight ratio, thrust to power ratio of the rotor, that could actually decrease the lift to drag ratio of the aircraft, and so on. So there are multiple, balances that we have to strike, and that's where we need to do these multiple iterations.
Hearing all of this is making me so excited. And I have to ask you, Professor, when do you see actual commercial operations being underway? When do we actually see passenger services?
We expect this to happen around the middle of 2027, and depends on, I think, the confidence level that the DGCA has. What we see from some of the aircraft abroad that are about a year ahead of us is there are indications that the regulatory agency could even start allow for commercial flights in a restricted manner ahead of getting the full certification. We are not really counting on that. We expect the certification to probably happen by the early second half of 2027. But if the confidence levels, if the flight testing, all of that stuff is complete ahead of that time, we might actually get an initial operational clearance even a bit before getting to the second half of 2027. So mid 2027 in general is actually a good time frame. So it's probably about, let's say, 15 to 18 months. Yeah.
About, yeah. So mid of 2027, maybe early 2028 at max. That's your
Yeah. I
estimate
mean,
right now?
yeah, we hope that it's not going to peep into 2028. Yeah.
And do you have any cities or a possible corridor in mind for that?
Our initial go-to-market, by the way, is actually on the air ambulances, and we will partner with air ambulance companies, and maybe they will in turn partner with state governments or whatever it is, or hospitals and all that stuff to figure out like where are the right routes for them. But definitely cities will top the list simply because they are the most congested. They are the most populous, and where there is people is where you need the ambulance anyway. We would expect that we're not necessarily going to be going at the most populous cities, but definitely traffic congestion is again a consideration for these ambulances. So my guess would be that Bangalore would top the charts, Bombay would top the charts, Delhi NCR, given security clearances for airspace utilization. Yeah, I would say that these three are definitely at the top of the list. You could then think about like a Chennai or a Hyderabad and a Kolkata and so on. Yeah, these are very typical, but we also expect that this could be done in remote areas, hilly areas, like large parts of Kerala, which have like backwaters and hilly terrain and all of that stuff. Yeah.
Could you share an early customer or stakeholder reaction to your demonstrator flights? For example, the air ambulance provider, and how that feedback is reshaping your go to market strategy.
Yeah, so the ambulance provider that we have signed up with is actually very keen on uh, configuring the internal the cabin with the stretcher to be moved in and all that stuff, and they are actually a critical care provider, so which means that they want more like an ICU on on with wings, which means that lots of different gadgets that need to be done, they will add to the weight budget. We need to actually position them right for the paramedic to be monitoring, and then all of the data to actually be transmitted to the hospital live. So those are all the things that we should actually be worrying about from a passenger point of view, from a customer point of view. But that said, I think the fact that we actually have the most compact aircraft in the world is something that everybody really cherishes in the first place. And the second thing is, I think building this out of India, we should actually be able to position it at a fairly lower cost when compared to international standards on what is it costing today to actually procure or acquire a air ambulance. So we should actually allow for these air ambulances to proliferate. The operating and maintenance costs as well are actually fairly low. So we are pretty upbeat about that with our customer thinking about this. Yeah.
With an estimated per trip fare at roughly 2.5 times that of Uber, how are you positioning ePlane in India's tier 1 and tier 2 cities to drive both affordability and scale?
Right. So I think it's a little less than 2.5. I think it's somewhere in the ballpark of 1.8 to 2 times
Wow.
is what we are thinking to begin with. The reason for that is actually the fact that each trip would take only about 10 minutes. And with the kind of flight profiles we have on compactness and slow flights, we can do multiple short trips in a single charge. By short trips, we mean about 20 to 30 kilometers. And by doing multiple short trips in a single charge, we can decrease the downtime for charging, and we can keep the aircraft busy to meet the demand. So a single asset would probably be able to clock somewhere around 50 flights. A similar distance to be carried out by a ground taxi would allow it to actually do only about 10 trips, 10 such distances. In the future, when ground taxis and taxis coexist, and at steady state, it's possible that taxis will probably do much shorter distances than what they do today, and allow the air taxis to take over for the longer distances. And therefore, the asset utilization with the aircraft is actually lot higher. It's about 5 times higher. So which essentially means that if you were to look at a scenario where all ground taxis were to be replaced, hypothetically speaking, by air taxis, we will need only about 20% of the ground taxi population for the number of air taxis required in the first place. So all of that put together, we can actually bring down the cost of offering the air taxi at to something that's just about double of what would an Uber cost today. Yeah.
From UAM to rocketry, India's regulatory landscape is evolving. What policy changes would accelerate private innovation, and where do you see the biggest gaps today, Professor?
Right. So I think policy and regulations always everywhere lag technological progress, because people, if they have to actually put in their heads together to develop policy or regulations, we need to see some kind of substance in technological development instead of just hype. And so the policymakers and the regulators wait it out to see how that shapes up. So in this case, if you were to actually think about rockets, we had ISRO doing all the rockets and satellites and all of that. And one of the things was if it's possible for us to actually utilize ISRO's help and support for development of private launch vehicles and satellites. In the early stages, I think it definitely looked like a conflict of interest for ISRO. But the policy was required to be shaped up to point out that with the private participation and the support that ISRO could give, this can actually expand the bandwidth of Indian space sector to play an active part in the global space economy. And that was actually very crucial for understanding that you need to have a third organization called InSpace to be set up that sort of mediates between ISRO and the private, what they now call as non-government entities or NGEs. That's in the space sector. In the for things like ePlane, for example, it actually comes under civil aviation, and so the Directorate of Civil Aviation tries to apply their minds to how this aircraft is similar to and different from existing aircraft and helicopters, and devise rules for not only the aircraft standards but also the operational details like where would they land and what kind of infrastructure is required over there, what standards they will have to meet, and all of those kinds of things. So and just having the regulations in place in time is actually enabling by itself to begin with. But as we proceed, what policies we would probably want to await is to see how the government wants to catalyze these kinds of innovations and developments by participating in either directly or indirectly on funding these either through grants or through equity or multiple other ways, and also develop incentives for these things to happen at multiple points of time of development. So these are things that are actually still in the anvil. There are multiple different ministries and government entities that are looking at this. For example, there is a space tech fund of funds that's being thought of. There is a deep tech fund of funds that's being thought of under the Department of Science and Technology. There is a defense tech fund of funds that's being thought of with Ministry of Defense. There is MATI fund of funds on electronics and communication. So there are multiple different things that are happening. And at some point, they will also actually start realizing that they need to actually coordinate among all of them so that there is no duplication of efforts or efforts at cross purposes and all of those things. But these are two nascent times for the government to actually get into these things very actively. But I think in the near future, within the next few months, maybe this will actually become very, very promising.
Looking at India's position in the global aerospace market, what unique advantages do we have? And where do you see the biggest opportunities?
So I think one standard thing that is actually widely accepted now is a very high level of talent pool, which is required for aerospace design development, prototyping, testing, certification, operations, all of that, manufacturing, all of that exists in India. The full stack of talent that's required end to end. And it's possible to actually accomplish this at about 1/10 or 1/20th, or sometimes even 1/100th of a cost of what it takes to do something similar at every level, at every stage elsewhere in the world, typically in the West. Even the Chinese developmental costs are actually higher than the Indian developmental costs. Elsewhere in the world, where the cost may be low, they do not really have the full stack of talent pool available. So it's actually a sweet spot of the talent being available and available at a affordable cost. This is something that is going to stand in good stead for India, at least through the next decade, until Indians become too expensive. I don't know when that will happen, because we do seem to be like a bottomless pit of talent. So there could be heavy competition for keeping the cost low for the foreseeable future. But then we do see that we keep increasing and improving up the value chain. So as you keep on going up the value chain, our costs will become higher over time. But while it lasts, I think we need to make use of it as we speak in present day market. The other thing that actually goes well for India is India as a market itself for consumer adoption of high technology, which typically happens for things like eVTOLs or hopefully for Hyperloop and so on in the future. But space technology, we don't really quite see. India is a big market. We do see India offering their technology to the rest of the world. And there is a large appetite from around the world to embrace Indian technology for the kind of cost structures we are able to offer it at. So two things essentially, it's about demand and supply effectively, right? So the supply is from the talent pool, the demand is from the market. Both of them actually go well for India today.
Do you think a country like ours should also look to develop a civilian airliner, just like China has done with a range of Comac airplanes? Although it is very well known where they have borrowed, and I use that word loosely, where they have borrowed their designs from, their technology, how they got it. But do you think a country as large as us, with a massive market, massive talent pool, world's third largest economy soon, should we have our own civilian airliner?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question is the way I look at it is it's actually it's a rhetorical question. I mean, the answer is resounding yes, for multiple reasons, not just as a bravado saying that hey, if you are a third largest economy in the world, we better have a civilian aircraft for no good reason. That's not the case. The talent pool, as I said, exists over here, but actually, much more importantly, there are vast differences between how a United States versus a China or a Russia or an India actually is distributed in terms of population and demographics. So if you look at the Indian map and look at the population density, it's actually spread very uniformly across the entire map of India, more or less. But maybe pockets of the Thar Desert in Rajasthan, or maybe if you want to include India, the Pakistan occupied Kashmir as part of the Indian map, which we traditionally do. But if you look at the population density, that really counts for like a civilian aircraft utilizing population that may actually get removed. Maybe a bit of parts of Northeast, maybe whether like hugely mountainous, rugged terrains and all that. But otherwise, you will see that the population is actually hugely uniformly distributed across the entire subcontinent. This is somewhat similar to Europe, for example, right? But if you look at large parts of Russia, large parts of China, many parts of the United States, the population distribution is not so uniform. So what does it really mean is we could actually be developing a lot of short-haul aircraft that can vitalize the economy by enabling people to move faster from place to place over much shorter distances, which otherwise takes longer distances by road today. We still have significant speed limitations on how much we can travel on highways. We need to have more and more highway throughput for enabling the traffic that's required, that's demanded. For example, the Chennai-Bangalore highway is already chock-a-block with trucks, and people are not able to freely drive. And where you can drive, you probably are capped at a speed of typically about 100, 130 kilometer per hour. Whereas if you were to actually drive in Germany, that kind of speed would be around 220 kilometer per hour. So there are infrastructure bottlenecks that are harder to surmount than if you were to actually focus on civil aviation of a kind that does not exist in the world. So today's planes are actually made by China or the United States or Europe, but they are all actually made for much larger movement of people with large planes, wide-bodied aircraft. Even if it is single-aisled, it's actually upwards of 150 passengers and so on. But there is a huge market in India for like about 100-seater that could be a lot more efficient. And the other thing is that most of the aircraft that actually fly today are all of typically about 1970 to 1980 design vintage in terms of like the gross features, the typical tube and wing architecture and so on, which have lift to drag ratios only of the order of about 18 max to max. Whereas there are newer architectures like blended wing bodies and all that stuff that can actually push the lift to drag ratio to about 25, You can lightweight structures grossly with carbon fiber, and so on. And then if you actually went electric on all of these with the propulsion, without having to have engines, you can actually more than half the cost of the aircraft itself, and the operating cost can actually come down to half of what they are today. So these things are actually mind-boggling, and we are actually at a cusp of where these technologies are mature and can be done in India right here, and should be done so that it'll actually benefit the Indian population significantly, a lot more than anywhere else in the world. This is something that nobody is thinking about, honestly. This entire business has to be pried open as quickly as possible.
We're seeing US startups like Joby, Archer, and PETA focus on UAM services. What lessons from their pilot programs resonate most with your vision and timelines?
Right. I mean, we do constantly learn from what's going on in other parts of the world, simply because they have started ahead of us, and they are quite a bit ahead of us, even as we are closing in on the gap. So as an aerospace engineer, and this would also be true for, like, what should I say, good aerospace engineers from other side of the world, to be looking out for what's happening in other places, because we just look at the tech, we just look at the science, we look at the engineering. We don't really bother too much about the competition and all of those things. So we do have some sense of how is the engineering panning out with a Joby or an Archer or a Beta and so on, and what is the kind of pathway that they're taking. For example, Beta trying to actually pivot to a conventional takeoff and landing instead of a vertical takeoff and landing to clock passengers much more quickly when compared to having to go through the certification for eVTOLs. Is actually pretty exemplifying, and they actually going to a full-scale IPO in the recent future, as opposed to like a SPAC-based IPO that they have done before, that Joby and Archer have done before, is also something that we might be wanting to learn from in terms of fundraising and so on. On the other hand, we also see moves by Archer and followed by that Joby to actually try to get certification done in the UAE, as opposed to completing the certification process with the FAA in the US. So these are all moves that we actually watch very closely to learn what is going on in that other part of the world, and how that might actually apply to us or not, and how we might want to actually get some elbow room in this part of the world that they're coming closer to. So there are a lot of learnings that we always watch out for and pick up from them. Yeah.
Professor, China's eHang has trialed fully autonomous air taxis. How far off is your team from commercializing autonomous features, and what regulatory alignment is needed?
Well, the quick answer on the last question is a resounding yes. We don't expect a regulatory alignment on this anytime in the future in parts of the world outside China for now on autonomous flying.
Can I ask why, and why is China so so liberal with that?
No, I don't think they're liberal either. So far, EHang has been permitted to do only tourist flights, which are like very, very short flights, maybe maybe about 15 minutes or something like that in one place. Like they take off from one place, just go around and come back to the same place. They have still not been allowed to do intra-city, across the city kind of travel yet, over crowded spaces and so on. So we believe that there will be a regulatory pushback on autonomous, at least in the next 7 to 10 years, perhaps. But that said, we are ready for unmanned aircraft, that is unpiloted or pilotless aircraft. In fact, in some sense, it's actually a bit easier to develop pilotless aircraft when compared to driverless cars, because the kind of obstacles that you will face would be far less, and maybe even predictable, with the kind of the flying course that we would go through normally, like in terms of takeoff to cruise to landing. It's possible to actually clear the path of all the obstacles, and then focus primarily on any potential dynamic obstacles that might come our way, and so on. There are artificial intelligence models that can keep track of this and all that stuff, right? So that development is actually doable, and we have actually done this with unmanned aircraft of a fairly large scale. So we can actually do this for even people transport, not a problem. It's just that, in fact, if the other thing is that most of the accidents that are caused is actually due to pilot error, and not all of them, but many of them. And therefore, if you don't have a and if you have to design an aircraft for a pilot, that actually is a bit of a pain, because we have to look at human machine interfaces, how the pilots might react, what are the edge cases of a pilot not understanding how to operate the aircraft, and how they might actually push the aircraft beyond its envelope, and how do we actually do envelope protection to face pilot errors, and lots of such things that have got to do with the pilot and not the aircraft at all. So and then, like, you'll have like literally hundreds or even thousands of pilots that come on board, and we have to actually look at all such edge cases despite the training that they would have. So it's actually difficult to do a pilot aircraft when compared to an unpiloted aircraft. That said, I think the regulations will actually be behind even public perception, but even the public perception is not yet ready for human transportation without a pilot, except for what EHang is doing. I'm not very sure if India or other parts of the world will even allow what China is doing with EHang. Which it remains to be seen. We are not trying to push that case at all here.
Yeah, I want to talk about another aspect of the business which is very important: ground infra. In Europe, Volocopter and Lilium have secured vertiport partnerships in cities like Paris and Munich. How critical is ground infrastructure coordination to your rollout plan?
Aircraft have to actually take off and land. If they can't, then there is no point in them being, I mean, hanging in the air. So and they have to take off and land from spaces that are regulated and follow standards. So fortunately, the standards are actually already available for people to follow, and the standards are not too difficult to go through. We are actually looking to partner with lots of such people who are interested in setting up these vertiports around the cities around in this part of the world. Yeah, I mean, we will probably announce those partnerships when we are able to seal them very well. But it is important that we actually do this right up front, because the time it takes for us to not just us, but anybody who is actually getting involved in this, to establish these what's so-called vertiports with the charging infrastructure and get them certified in time for the aircraft to start operating out of them. The time is right now, so we have to actually do that right now. Yeah.
You've mentioned the goal of making flying ubiquitous, multiple points. Paint us a picture of what urban mobility will look like in Indian cities by 2030, and how will your companies shape that future?
Right. So 2030, 31 is probably the time when we could start sensing this ubiquity of mobility that I have been talking about. Not sooner than that, I believe. We will actually put our planes uh, well before that, maybe about 2 or 3 years before that, but it will take time for us to ramp up to the level that you're expecting by 2030, 31. So that's actually a very good time that you asked about. So what we want to do is to essentially imagine a future where people step out of their apartments in a very large apartment complex that a lot of people live in, and instead of actually taking the lift downstairs to like a parking lot or a parking deck or whatever it is, or underground parking, they actually take the lift up to the terrace, and they would have hailed a taxi to come and land on the terrace. They go up, and then there is the aircraft that is coming up to pick them up, and then it actually goes and lands where they want to go to, and they get out of the aircraft, and then they take the lift down to the floor that they want to get into, right? So this is actually the ideal situation that we would like to achieve. This could happen progressively from 10% of the cases to 50% of the cases to hopefully close to 100% of the cases, but it'll never really get to 100%. You will have some people having to do, or many people having to do like a first mile and a last mile. They have to negotiate that when compared to the flight segment itself. And the goal will actually be to try to shorten this first and last mile segments to something like about 200 meters. That could be walkable as opposed to having to take a ground transport for that segment and so on. But in the run up to getting there, the distances that they have to do from on the first and last mile could be longer, in which case we will have to partner with a ground transportation segment partner, and we need to have like a seamless hailing of the cab, so to speak, that will come and take you to where you are. The intermodality of ground transportation and air transportation should be a matter of detail that the actual passenger should not really have to worry too much about. Everything should get aligned for her to step into the car, get to the depot, get up the escalator or whatever that is, to get to the tarmac, and the aircraft is actually waiting for her, and she gets in, lands the other side, gets down and comes down the escalator or whatever, and there is a cab that's waiting for her to take her to the actual destination. So these are how we will actually be changing the mobility landscape in my mind. Yeah.
How do you cultivate a culture of rapid prototyping and risk taking across teams working on both aircraft and rocket engines?
I think it's a matter of having like a goal setting. Like one of the things that we actually do is develop something called top level requirements for every prototype. So if a prototype actually is to meet certain set of requirements, it has to actually have certain things and no more. So we will have to then focus on what is required for this prototype and just focus on that and get that out of the way, so that the prototyping can actually happen without any hassle or without any bottlenecks. But focus on what additional features are required for the next prototype alongside over a longer time that it may take, so that we will be able to deliver those requirements for that prototype when we have to get to build that prototype. So it's kind of like a long-term program of multiple prototypes, with each of them having their respective top level requirements that we have to focus with a razor sharp focus, and get them done, like ticking check boxes on what's required for each of those. That's fundamentally what it is all about. The actual technologies that we use for developing these prototypes, be it 3D printing or whether it is a carbon fiber layup or combinations of multiple different manufacturing methods, all of them essentially have things like lead times, uncertainties with external vendor dependencies, and all of those things. So everything has to actually be managed as part of a program. And that's essentially how we try to, if I may use the word, rapidize prototyping processes.
Professor, as far as the regulatory framework is concerned, how do you anticipate certification frameworks, whether that is FAA's Part 23 amendments or ESA's SC-VTOL? How do you anticipate these converging or diverging? And what does that mean for an India designed eVTOL?
Yeah, so we were actually torn by these considerations in the 2022-2023 timeframe. And at the time, I think EASA's SC-VTOL was actually getting firmed up. We did not see much of a clarity from FAA and none from India. But subsequently, in the last 1 year, I would say, yeah, more than a year, but very specifically in September of 2024, India actually released its aircraft certification regulations, which is actually an amalgamation of both EASA's SC-VTOL and FAA's Part 23 special conditions for VTOL. So what we have to follow is just DGCA's rules for what's called as VTOL capable aircraft, or VCA rules, and they could be actually harmonized with EASA, similarly with the FAA, whenever we need to do. And I think the VCA rules were framed with the outlook that Indian OEMs could actually be able to export their aircraft to other geographies. So we need to be compatible with other geographies' regulations. And so I think there is a significant amount of compatibility that's already been established.
Which country's regulatory and infrastructure ecosystem impresses you the most? Is it USA's FAA sandbox? Is it UK's future of flight plan? Is it China's UAM zones? Something else?
Honestly, I think the Indian VCA is actually a very good mix. They are actually very pragmatic. They have taken a look at what are the different considerations of EASA versus FAA and how to uh, ideally mix them, but also take a appropriate dose from each of these. And where there is lack of clarity, we can always fall back to EASA's means of compliance. These are still actually um, work in progress between us and the DGCA. So we are developing means of compliance that DGCA will examine to see if it can be adopted for other OEMs that may come right after us, and so on. But all these things are actually part of the game that we had to be part of. And I'm actually pretty happy with what DGCA has been doing.
All right. Do you foresee a dominant business model emerging? Something like the OEM and the operator and the ride hail integration along with multiple led fleets? And where will ePlane position itself? That's what I really want to know from you.
Yeah, so there are, first of all, multiple use cases, right? So if it is going to be air ambulances, it's a different use case when compared to let's say air taxis. There could be air cargo. Air cargo could actually be either manned or unmanned, depending upon the drone rules versus the aircraft rules that may apply to these different aircraft. So all of these will have to actually coexist. So there must be air traffic management rules that allow for all of these to happen. So these things will emerge over time. Similarly, you will also actually have defense logistics play coming in, that could actually be part of the entire mix. And as you said, we also believe that municipalities and city metros could be interested in having like multimodal connectivity that's enabled by urban air mobility or advanced air mobility. So there could be multiple customers. So what we feel is that our job is to actually make a plane and sell it. So we need to find a manufacturing partner who will make it to the specs that we are developing, the processes that we are developing, build to print, so to speak. And then we push it to multiple operators. We do not know whether we will actually get into the operations ourselves in the future, but we will essentially push these planes in the near term to potential operators of different use cases.
Professor, the industry seems to be splitting into different applications. There is a short urban hop application, then there is longer regional flights like Lilium's approach. You have cargo delivery. There are, of course, medical services, something we have already discussed. Which application do you believe will achieve commercial viability first and why?
So we obviously want to be looking at commercial viability of everything that we want to get into. So we have developed realistic unit economics around these. For example, you asked this question about how is it possible for you to offer something at around just about twice the Uber fare for about 5 to 10 times reduction in travel time. That's based on a unit economics and a profit margin that can be clocked with every flight, and how it will actually be amortized um, over what time to make good the aircraft's cost itself. All of those things have been done. And similarly, we have an air ambulance unit economics that pays for itself instead of having to look for subsidies and so on. We have not really done the air cargo unit economics as much. It's very, very rough. And question basically is that will eVTOLs actually be doing the job for cargo companies effectively for like a mid-mile transport at an aerial level, or do they actually require like a regional transportation that might actually open up their markets much better, and so on. So we don't know that yet. We have to explore those with potential cargo companies and then make up our minds on how we want to present it to them in terms of like what kind of an aircraft. Is it going to be like a conventional takeoff and landing aircraft over a larger distance and larger payloads, or will it actually still be the plain vanilla eVTOL that just takes cargo instead of people? So those are things that we're not very clear about. But the other use cases, yes. For example, tourism can actually work fairly well. Pilgrim centers, which are kind of like specialized tourist locations, they can attract well because ambulances, tourism, pilgrim centers, these are all where each individual actually uses the aircraft only once in a while in their life, and that too with companions, and they don't mind spending for that particular one-off time that they actually have to spend. And particularly air ambulance is much more time critical. Airport shuttles are time critical. So wherever you have actually time criticality or like a one-off spending that they do on where people generally tend to splurge a bit more during tourist trips and pilgrim trips and stuff, those actually can work better than even a conventional air taxi, a regular air taxi, where people might actually be using it like day in and day out. So the unit economics for that taxi being working out well, it also means that most of the other use cases should actually pay for themselves much better.
How are advanced cities like Dubai, Singapore, Los Angeles, how are they integrating eVTOL corridors into existing transit networks? And is there something we can learn from it? Is there something that Indian metros can they emulate something?
Yeah, I mean, what Dubai has done is to so Dubai's RTA, the Road Transport Authority, has evaluated multiple options early on and has signed up with Joby for the aircraft services and with Skyports of UK for setting up vertiports. And this is actually as part of their public transportation mix. And this is essentially a shared mobility platform that they want to offer to their citizens in the city. But that said, we should be able to explore things like our ambulance services, tourist attractions, and other means of aerial transport that private citizens might want, and also have vertiports developed by construction sector people, real estate people, and so on. What the RTA is doing to offer the public transport with Joby and Skyports does not preclude the other things from happening and other aircraft from operating over there, is my understanding. But whatever they have started on for other services than just public transportation. I think that's happening in Dubai for sure. Abu Dhabi is not too far behind, but uh, it's not so clear exactly who they will want to go with for the vertiports. There are indications that they're actually signing up with Abu Dhabi, with Archer, but not sure about the exclusivity part of it. And similarly, there are other Emirates that are also evaluating these kinds of options right now. And that's actually as far as the UAE is concerned. And there is other kingdoms and similar such countries in the region that are also keenly looking at these developments to emulate. And that's actually as far as the Middle East is concerned. And similarly, if you now move your lens to, let's say, the Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, those regions, they're also actually kind of brewing with ideas on what could happen. It's actually an amazing time to be in, where these things are just germinating in different places, just as India is. And there are some of these countries that actually look up to India for regulations, the maturity of regulations that we are able to show, and the alacrity with which we have been able to develop this and all that stuff. So it's very interesting to be where we are as we speak.
For young engineers and entrepreneurs watching your journey, what three pieces of advice would you offer for tackling frontier tech challenges?
I think what seems to be unique are two or three things. One is today, I think there is a significant democratization of technological access. And by technological access, I mean two things. One is the possibility to develop technology has been democratized. That means that technology can be developed in different parts of the world. It's not like a sole preserve of only a few people, for no matter how high tech it is. So anybody around anywhere in the world should actually be able to take a shot at it. is what is one learning that we have gone through. The second learning is the frugality with which some of us are able to actually pull this off when compared to other parts of the world could be pretty astounding. When it's all done and dusted, I think lots of things will be written about that aspect as much as the fact that we are able to do it in the first place, as I mentioned. And the third is actually the access to technology in terms of being able to use it affordably, not just develop it affordably. So these are things that are actually happening around the world in parts that were not expected to do so even about 5 to 10 years back. And that's something that could actually inspire a lot of people to take up these kinds of what might be audacious endeavors.
I certainly look forward to the next 2 years and seeing ePlane aircraft flying overhead. And then, like you said, in the next 5 years or so, hopping on, having a ride of a lifetime.
Sure. Well, you probably will actually start using it every day in your life.
Fantastic. That sounds great. Thank you
Yeah.
again, and
Thank you.
thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much. I enjoyed it.
Well, the professor has left us with a clear blueprint for what electric air mobility could be, and a welcome reminder that the future of flight is engineered one stubborn experiment at a time. Next Sunday, the Indian AvGeeks episode 12 will feature Ivan Fernandez, the man making waves on LinkedIn with his thought leadership on the business of advertising. For now, don't forget to subscribe and share this episode of the Indian AvGeek with your fellow AvGeeks. Professor is not active on X, but you can follow him as well as the ePlane company on LinkedIn, and you will find me everywhere as at Vishal1 Mehra. Happy to have your feedback. With that, keep your tray tables up, your seatbelts fastened. I wish you well and happy flying, my friends.